Hello, welcome everybody. I'd like to just say something brief about foreign policy. As we are thinking about all the crises that we have in the world, and Ukraine is on top of my mind these days, we sometimes, when we think of foreign policy, we want to send a signal that we are really wanting to achieve something realistic. And so typically you hear advocates for the politics of something that's realistically achievable, for Realpolitik, or some others call it power politics. And what this is basically about is that we should focus on our interests. You hear this all the time. We should focus on our interest. What's important is what matters to us, to our national interest, to whatever. And that sounds good. The demand for Realpolitik typically sounds very smart and sober. I mean, who wouldn't want to be real? Who wouldn't want to be focused in their politics on that which is solid, which is grounded, which we can achieve? However we want to look at this, in the end, dreams are nice, visions are nice, but that doesn't really typically translate into concrete politics. We all know that we all have interests. What are these interests? You could say security, trade, making sure that we can defend ourselves against whatever our enemies are, that we can work together with our partners. Or maybe some believe we don't need partners. I mean, many empires in the past haven't really thought of needing partners, and many countries in the past built empires in order to be safe, to be secure, to maximize their interests, their resources, and to eventually maybe eliminate the need for partners. I mean, if you're as big as you can possibly get, like the British Empire in its time, the Roman Empire in antiquity, why do you need partners? But this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting. For instance, we know that Rome paid money in tributes to Germanic tribes. Sometimes trade is also something that connects. Sometimes you conduct trade whether you really need it or not. It's always good to trade and to connect. We know that before the 2022 escalation of the war of Russia against Ukraine, which has been going on since 2014, countries like Germany and others insisted on still getting gas and oil and other things from Russia. We know that between the US and China, we've entangled ourselves so much that Fareed Zakaria some time ago even talked of Chimerica. And these connections are good. I mean, if either the US or China decided to go to war against each other, well, sober minds would then say, well, our economic interests are so closely intertwined that we would really be hurting ourselves. We know that Taiwan is crucial as a country that makes all kinds of advanced microchips that no country in the world can do without. And just as the West is reliant on China, China is reliant on the West. We see now with the sanctions against Russia, Russia really is reliant on the West. They didn't want to admit it. We've been relying on the West for on Russia for some things, and Russia has been relying on us for other things. And so this connection ideally works out, but we've seen that this hasn't stopped the war. also, when we really think about our interests, are there interests that go beyond that which is material? That's what's measurable. I mean, that's why Joseph Nye coined the term soft power. Soft power, however, isn't really as soft as we think it is. And we may think of movies, books, diplomacy. Well, diplomacy can also be more than soft. But let's hone in on this a little bit more closely. You see that I'm maybe rambling a little bit, but the point of these videos is to kind of think together, or to watch me thinking, and hopefully, or pretending to be thinking, hopefully to get you to think alongside some things. And so hopefully we can have a conversation sometime in the future. Anywho, are these values something, are they these, when we think of soft power communicates some values. Are these values something that are just luxury? Or do they really mean something? We know that some representatives of some countries really seem to be very annoyed at whatever can be called Western values, or at us pushing, allegedly. What are these values? Well, there's certainly something that the West hasn't cared deeply about for a long time. Yeah, at a certain point, we'll have to have a discussion about what the West actually is. And it's one of those words that seems intuitively clear, but is much more complicated than we would probably admit. But whatever those values are, intuitively we would say it's something, when you think of Western values, like freedom, democracy, human rights, and stuff like that. Well, we know that before the end of World War II, these values weren't really as successful within the West as we would like to think. If we go beyond maybe 1914, the number of democracies in the world is rather low. Some countries like Germany, for the first time, really had democracy after World War I in the Weimar Republic. Then Nazi times pushed it away, and then there was democracy in the West since 1949. The United States, of course, 1776 with independence, began part of its democratic trajectory while there was still slavery, and whatever we call now human rights weren't really universally recognized in the US. And there could be some arguments made to say that really since the civil rights movement, much of those deficits were finally overcome. In many other countries of the current West, like Spain, Portugal, Greece, there were dictatorships till the 1970s. We know that the former Soviet bloc that is now democratic used to not be democratic because of Soviet domination. Much of the global South were colonies, and they only became democratic-ish since the 1960s. And so the whole history of democracy and freedom is really much more complicated. There is no direct line from Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic to today. There isn't. So that's a story we like to tell, but it's not true. It's an inspirational story, but it's not true. So whatever we think of as the West is a much more recent creation than we would like to think. And I would suggest that it's safest to think of the term West as anything meaningful in comparison to what we think of it, maybe since the middle of the 20th century, after World War II, and then expanding. So when we have the Genocide Convention, that's why we talked about this earlier in another video. That's why we have the evolution of human rights and all of these. When we think of human rights, there are still some rights that are not universally recognized, especially when it comes to discussions of gender, sex, sometimes even race and caste. None of these are necessarily conversations that have led to any conclusive results. We know that the genocide against Ukraine isn't the only genocide going on right now. We know that there are people that are suffering as a people all over the planet. We also know that human rights are also endangered by our ecological policies or lack of those. But here we already see that when you think of these just as values, Western values, it's much more concrete than we think. Should we give up on human rights? Should we give up on some human rights? Should we limit them? Should we say, well, it's okay for people like us to have these rights, but others, yeah, well, it's not their culture. Who decides that? Does the Chinese Communist Party or Communist Party of China, whatever they want to call themselves nowadays, do they get to decide whether human rights are there for Chinese people? Does Vladimir Putin get to decide whether human rights apply to Russians? Yeah. There are questions here about legitimacy of rule, about cultural relativism, and about sometimes undoing what we thought we already had understood as a species with the founding of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights. So these discussions about values now become manifestly important to human beings all over the planet. If we now say we are the West, or we are part of the West, or we are an important country of the West, no matter who we here is, and we are reneging on those values, then we are playing into the hands of Putin or Xi. Yeah. So when we say, these values aren't really for everybody, and it's good if we have them, but you don't need them, then are they really values at all? If we have politicians that say, well, human rights can be applicable in our country, but in country X, they are not historically part of that country, so we don't expect them to do them. Now, if you have other political forces now in our country that say, well, historically these rights haven't been really applicable in our own country either, so maybe the same cultural relativism argument it just made about country X, we should actually make about our own country. Yeah? So questioning human rights, questioning Western values for other countries eventually hits us ourselves. If we make an argument that, let's say, women's rights aren't necessarily guaranteed in some countries of the world, we'll easily discover that women's rights haven't really been honored in our countries either. Are women's rights really a Western tradition? We know that LGBTQ rights are a recent achievement in most Western countries too. We know that the idea that no matter what skin color you have, you're a human being and should have the same rights as other people That's a reason discovered in the West too. So if we start chipping away at this idea of values globally, we are starting to chip away at values domestically, or vice versa. And maybe that's the whole point. So ask yourself, when people refuse to defend our values in the world and speak out against us speaking up for our values, what does this mean domestically? Also, if we say we have these values, but we don't really necessarily care for them that much, then what connects us to our allies and our partners? If we take the example of the United States again, the United States could be big enough to not need allies or partners, in theory. Well, really? I mean, yes, the Atlantic and Pacific are sea borders. Towards the north, Canada doesn't seem like much of a threat. Towards the south, Mexico has problems of its own. But none of this is set in stone. We have technology now that makes nobody on the planet safe from anything. And this notion that we don't need allies or partners, you may think of that as something a big country or an empire can afford to think. But empires are only empires because everybody agrees they're empires. Big countries are only big because of the influence they can have around the world. So, if we abdicate on values, we limit our own power, not just soft power, but eventually hard power. Because we tell other countries that, you know, in case of doubt, you can't rely on us. Would the United States be able to survive without NATO? Well, we don't have to answer this question in the hypothetical. It happened twice before, World Wars I and II. If you go back, there have been other world wars. You know, the Crimean War in the 19th century was already a worldwide war. The 7 Years' War or French and Indian War was worldwide. The Napoleonic Wars had global consequences. And the decision of the United States to eventually chaperone NATO and the European Union and other alliances across the world is the result of the catastrophic results all those conflicts between foreign powers had on the United States itself. So, World War I happened, US gets dragged in. World War II happened, US gets dragged in. Cold War happened, US from the beginning is dragged in. So, NATO is not a luxury. NATO is the guarantee that we'll try to work with our partners and allies to prevent something like World War I and II to happen again. Our cooperation with China is part of the idea to not have a war coming up. Although, there's a caveat there. With Russia, we are seeing that partnership with Russia can come, or was able to come to a blow when it comes to Russian politics towards what they see or what some in Russia see as their former imperial strongholds. Putin is doing what he's doing because, first of all, he can, or he thought he could. He's finding out he really can't. And second of all, because there are justifications from a Russian perspective to say all these lands should be part of Russia because they were part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or whatever. But what Russia is doing stands against our values. So at a certain point, we come to this deciding point between values and economic and other interests. When it comes to China's ideas about Taiwan and China's history with Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, we are again in a pick'em. Because what's been happening in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia is, at the very least, colonization, probably combined with some form of ethnic cleansing or domination, and amounting to genocide. We are still in business with China. Some people say, well, we should remain in business and then we can have these conversations. Yeah, but we must have these conversations. And why do we have to have those conversations? Because if we don't have them, we are sending the very signal that Vladimir Putin sees as a confirmation that the West doesn't take its values seriously. Putin's argument from the beginning has been the West doesn't really believe what they say they believe. And in many ways, sometimes we don't. Yeah, if we can make money, yeah, well, values, do they really matter? But that's a short-sighted perspective. And so, if we prioritize power politics over values, eventually that'll hurt us. I'm not saying we shouldn't be smart about how we do politics. But if we give up on our values, if we give up on promoting those values globally, if we give up on supporting the idea that these are human rights, human values, and they're actually encoded in the United Nations, if we give up on them, then who are we? What gives us the right to say this or that is right or wrong? Yeah, so we need to live them as a country, as a people, in our own countries, and we need to stand up for them globally, because only then will we have allies and partners. And so there's a selfish argument also to stick to our values, to not be isolationist, to not give up on the idea of alliances, and so on. Yeah, so that I hope something tied together here, and we'll have further conversations about that. Thank you very much. This was Erratic Attempts. I'm Dr. Philipp Kneis, and see you soon.